Hi there, welcome to Chapter 3 of the build series on how to build your own quadcopter. In this part of the build series we're going to be going over most of the electrics, and I'll be showing you how to install the motors, the ESCs, as well as the power board for the quadcopter. The power board itself comes pre-soldered, which is nice, so we won't have to do any soldering. And the battery cable is also attached. The ESCs we're using are the Afro 30 amp ESCs. The motors we're installing are the D28, 22, 1450 kV Turnigy motors, and they come with an accessory pack. Now I've already gone ahead to save time and installed 3 of the 4 motors, so I'll be showing you how to install the final motor. As I was doing my build, I noticed that in order to install the motor properly, you should take the motor and remove the landing gear and then install the motor, instead of trying to install the motor as is with the landing gear in place. So it kind of requires going back in the installation process a little, but this is just something that I picked up while I was working on the build. Let's go ahead and open this. So the motor comes with a manual, or I should say a spec sheet, and it has most of the information about the motor, including what type of lipos you can use. Just put this to one side. This is the accessory bag, and it comes with everything you need to install your prop as well. And here's our motor. And the nice thing about this motor is that it also comes with the bullet connectors pre-soldered. So all you really have to do is connect them in a plug-and-play fashion with the 30 amp ESCs, which we have. So it's very nice. It saves a lot of installation times and soldering. So we'll move these things to one side for now. We'll go ahead and remove the landing gear. And if you remember, with these landing gear, we're not supposed to tighten them all the way anyways, simply to allow for the landing gear mechanism to be able to function with the dampening that the spring allows. So make sure you don't tighten your landing gear all the way, otherwise you're taking away from the dampening function of the landing gear. Okay, so I've removed the screw and the bolt which is holding in the landing gear, the final one. Put these to one side. And carefully flip this over. And remove the landing gear. I'm just trying to get the spring off of the spacer without bending it too much. If you do end up bending or pulling on the springs with the dampening system too much, you can actually end up ruining the spring. So you want to make sure when you're installing it that you don't play with it just a little too much, and then otherwise you will have to get new springs or figure out a new way to install the dampening system. So we have the landing gear removed, put it to one side. Now we can go ahead and install the motor. The screws for the motor come in the accessory pack. So we'll open the Ziploc bag, take out the mounting screws. There's 4 screws as well as the prop. So to install the motor, essentially all you're really doing is lining up the smaller screw holes, and you can actually see the threading inside of them, so you know that obviously they're for screws. And all you have to do is really line these screws up with the motor mounts for your frame and just screw them in. And these are Phillips screws for your motor. You don't want to tighten any of the screws right away, simply because you want to allow for a little bit of movement for the motor to be able to adjust its placement until you're ready to finally tighten everything in place. You will need to adjust the motor a little bit. So you want to be able to allow for that play. I'm sure there is a way to install the motors without removing the landing gear, but I personally, just to make sure that the installation that I'm doing is secure installation, because obviously this will be up in the air at some point, I just feel better going ahead and removing the landing gear. So it just is about going back a step or two. You know, in the end of the frame you're putting up in the air, it's going to be more secure and more stable. And obviously remember that right now this is simply to show for instructional purposes. You do want to thread lock everything that you possibly can in your frame. And the last screw. And once you have all 4 screws installed, then you can go ahead and essentially make sure that your motor is centered, and then go ahead and tighten them in. These screws don't come with washers, and so these were the only screws I dealt with on this frame that didn't use washers. You want to make sure they're nice and firmly tight. But obviously don't over tight to the point that you damage the frame. So once that is done, your motor is essentially installed, you can go ahead and reinstall your landing gear. In my experience, I always found it a little bit easier to first install the landing gear and then install the spring mechanism. But you're free to do whichever is easier for you. Installing the landing gear is simply a matter of installing the screw and the bolt back in place. Tighten them. And remember, don't over tighten. actually want your landing gear to be securely tightened. That's too much. Go back a little bit. So we're good. Now we can reinstall the spring. I personally find it easy using one of the Allen keys which I'm using to basically prop it into place. It is a little bit tedious, but hopefully we get it. So we have it installed finally. It's nice and dry. And obviously, if you do notice that one of your landing gears is more firm than the other one, then you can always go back and adjust your landing gear. So let's say one is more firm than the other one, you can go back and adjust them. But these are fine for now. Next, we're simply going to install the prop adapter. So we'll flip the frame back to its normal position. To install the prop adapter, we simply unscrew the top portion of the prop adapter, and we take the bottom portion and we simply put it on the top of the motor. And we have to very lightly tap it in to a position in which it's no longer going any lower. So you have to be very careful that you don't over tap or do it too hard, because you could obviously damage your motor. So we have to be nice and firm hits, but not too hard. And you don't have to hit as many times as I did, but you do have to make sure that it goes in as low as possible. And in this case, for these motors, it's not actually going to go in all the way. It is going to stop a little bit off of the bottom portion. Once that is done, we can simply install the top portion of the prop adapter, which essentially tightens the whole mechanism into place to hold the prop in place. We won't be installing the props in this portion of the video, simply because it's not safe to install your props until you're ready for flight. And so we'll be doing the props and the electrics and the KK board and things like that in the next chapter. So once this is done, we can move on to installing our ESC. The reason I went with 30 amp ESC is simply because they just offer you more power capabilities. So if you decide to punch the motors or upgrade your motors or use a higher power battery, you're just better off with a higher power ESC. So I always recommend going with as high ESC as possible. You obviously don't want overkill either, but 30 amp is more than enough. And Afro ESCs are actually designed specifically for multi-rotors, so they're very nice. And we won't probably even need to calibrate these ESCs like you normally do with some of the ESCs that you order. So we'll see how it goes, but apparently you don't need to calibrate these, and we won't need to be calibrating them with the motor. So we'll see how that goes. So, but for now, let's go ahead and install the ESC. We're simply going to use a couple of zip ties. In this frame, you do have the option, depending on the type of ESC you're using and the size of the ESC, that you could pass the wires through the frame. But in our case, because of the type of ESC we're using, we don't have that option. So we're going to try to place them as neatly as possible on top of the frame. Once you've decided how you're going to place them, you have to make sure that the wires from your motor essentially plug in to the wires to your ESC. And because these are already bullet connected, it's very easy. Red simply goes to red, black goes to black, yellow goes to yellow. So I'll go ahead and do that now. Once that's done and they're firmly connected, we can go ahead and install the ESC onto the arm. Once the wires are firmly tightened to the frame, we can snip off the excess wire tie. And now, as you can see, we have our motor installed and we have our ESCs connected. And we can move on to the next portion of the install, which is installing the power board. So we'll move the wires out of the way for now. To install the power board, there are a variety of ways you can put this onto your frame. Some people choose to even mount them inside in the center of the frame, which I personally won't be doing simply because it would require going further back in the installation process, and also I don't think it's exactly the best place to put it. Preferably, what most people do is install it on top of the frame of the platform, so that's what we'll be doing. There is a sticky portion for installing the board if you want to apply adhesive or anything like that, but we're simply going to be using the nylon screws and passing them through the points. The nylon screws which we installed earlier, they're going to be used essentially to hold the board in place, and we will need to order extra nylon, either spacers or screws, depending on how you're installing your board, to tighten into place. In our case, I'm going to be using the nylon spacer simply because we do need to install the KK board on top of this. So we'll go ahead and install our power board now. You can essentially place it in any position. It doesn't matter how, which side is facing which side. You simply line it up with the nylon spacers underneath. You can go ahead and tighten it into place. And whenever you're tightening anything in a cross pattern or an X pattern, you should always make sure that you don't over tighten anything until you've tightened all four, and then you can go ahead and firmly tighten them. Now these spacers will essentially allow for the KK board to be installed on top, and like I said, there's lots of different options you can exercise when you want to install your KK board to give it more protection, for example. So I have seen examples of people ordering extra top plates, and once they have their KK board installed on top of the frame, they actually install the top plate, which is a matching HobbyKing frame top plate, and you put it on top of your KK board, and that gives it an extra level of protection in the event that you do eventually manage to flip your quadcopter at any point, so that way you won't damage your KK board. And another good thing is that HobbyKing is also selling protection cases for your KK boards now, so that's an added level of protection, protected against any damage. So now we're going to go ahead and install the ESCs. And another nice thing about these ESCs is because they're pre-soldered with their bullet connectors on these ends as well, they simply just connect into your power board. So we'll just go ahead and plug them in. And obviously black will go into black, red will go into red. You want to be nice and firm when you're installing your bullet connectors, but you don't want to be too over firm, simply because you don't want to damage the soldering on the bullet board. But don't worry, it does take a little bit of muscle to push them in. I have been reading the comments that some of you are having experience with your screws being a little too hard to install. And in my case, I haven't really had that issue that much. Although before going ahead with any installation video, I always do make sure that I have all of my parts tested and laid out. Finally, the last one. Okay, so for this part of the installation process, we have gone ahead and installed the motors, the prop adapters, the ESCs, and we've also gone ahead and installed our power board and connected our ESCs to the power board. In the next part of the video series, we're going to be installing the KK board and essentially setting up the KK board for pre-flight. I hope you enjoyed this part of the tutorial. If you have any questions, please comment. Please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.